18 years had passed since the accident that took her parents, leaving young Cecilia Hawthorne orphaned at 5 and alone in the cold world, where she learned quickly that survival meant painting portraits for pennies and writing haunting stories that no one truly read, but which kept the hungry ghosts of her memory at bay, always just barely managing to pay the meager rent for her attic room. The scent of turpentine and stale coffee was her constant companion, clinging to the worn fabric of her thin clothes as she spent endless nights hunched over cheap sketch pads, the desperate scratch of charcoal on paper mirroring the frantic beat of her own lonely heart, praying that the meager earnings from this week's commissioned dog portrait would last until the next, a grim, cyclical existence stretching out before her like a barren road leading nowhere. This monotonous, gray existence was abruptly shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when the postman, a kindly old man with shaking hands, delivered a heavy, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a thick, unfamiliar wax bearing the swirling image of a broken laurel wreath, instantly setting off a cold, prickling shiver of dread that had nothing to do with the drafty window pane. The vellum paper inside felt like dried skin against her fingers, and the formal, looping script informed her that as the sole living heir to her late great-aunt, Cecilia Hawthorne, she had inherited the sprawling, isolated estate known only as Primrose Hill, nestled deep within the forgotten, misty moorlands, a place she had never heard of but which instantly felt deeply familiar in a terrible, subconscious way. The lawyer's address was cryptic, the wording unnecessarily ominous, detailing that the estate was hers on the condition that she lived there for a full calendar year, a condition that sounded less like an inheritance clause and more like a carefully constructed, ancient curse designed specifically to trap her. Driven by a desperate need for financial salvation and a consuming, inexplicable curiosity about the familial secret she had unknowingly carried for years, Cecilia packed her worn satchel with her sketchbooks and the few clothes she owned, taking the meager savings she had accumulated and beginning the journey toward the distant hill. The drive was endless and unsettling, winding roads giving way to skeletal, black trees that clawed at the heavy, silver sky, until finally, through a curtain of persistent, chilling rain, she saw it. Primrose Hill, a titanic, Gothic mansion perched atop the lonely rise, its shadowed architecture resembling a petrified beast, all jagged spires and lightless, gaping windows that stared down at her with malice. The air immediately grew thick and still, muffling the sound of the car engine and replacing it with a profound, unnerving silence that felt less like the absence of sound and more like the sound of something vast and terrible holding its breath, waiting patiently for her approach. The front door, massive and carved with grotesque, faded figures that seemed to shift in her peripheral vision, stood ajar, inviting her into the dark embrace of the entrance hall, which smelled heavily of dust, decay, and the metallic tang of dried blood. As the door slammed shut behind her with a bone-shaking crash that echoed through the empty wings of the house, Cecilia knew instantly that she had made a terrible mistake, that this was no salvation but a trap set by forces beyond human comprehension and control. The letter had mentioned a caretaker, but no one appeared, leaving her completely alone in the echoing silence to navigate the oppressive, paralyzing fear that began to coalesce in the very depths of her stomach, warning her of the horrors that slept beneath the decaying floorboards. She carried her solitary lantern up the grand, curving staircase, its velvet runner long shredded by time and rot, the silence broken only by the rhythmic creak of the old wood protesting beneath her uncertain weight, each step a further descent into the mansion's palpable madness. Her bedroom, a vast, oppressive space with a towering four-poster bed and heavy velvet drapes, was dominated by a single, disturbing oil painting of a woman with eyes that seemed to follow Cecilia's movements, a woman who bore a frightening and unmistakable resemblance to her own face, despite being painted decades, perhaps a century, before she was born. That first night was a brutal symphony of the uncanny, marked by the faint, wet sound of something dragging itself across the attic floor directly above her, and the low, throaty whispering that seemed to emanate not from the walls, but from the very shadows themselves, coiling around her like cold, suffocating vines. When dawn finally arrived, a weak, gray light filtering through the grimy windows, Cecilia discovered a small, locked journal hidden beneath the floorboards near the fireplace, its cover bound in what felt disturbingly like human leather, confirming her growing suspicion that the house was alive with a malevolent, ancient consciousness. The journal belonged to Cecilia Hawthorne, and its entries grew increasingly frantic, detailing bizarre rituals performed in the cellar, references to a crimson pact with a non-human entity, and the gruesome need for the artist's sacrifice to sustain the house's eternal life and power. One particular entry described a chamber hidden behind the library bookcase, sealed with a protective circle of salt, and driven by a desperate compulsion to uncover the full truth of her inheritance. Cecilia ignored every shred of rational thought and sought out the secret room, the dread tightening like a vice around her ribs. Behind the shifting bookcase, she found not a room, but a narrow, winding staircase that led down into the earth, where the air was heavy with the stench of copper and decay, and the faint, wet echo of dripping water seemed to count down the minutes until her inevitable end. The descent led her into a cavernous, subterranean space, a sacrificial altar carved from black obsidian stone, surrounded by rusted shackles, and illuminated by a flickering, unnatural green light that pulsed with the rhythm of some infernal, hidden heart. Scattered across the cold stone floor were hundreds of paintings, not of landscapes or portraits, but of screaming faces, each one depicting a single moment of absolute, soul-shattering terror, perfectly rendered in shades of black and deep, sickening crimson. As Cecilia stared at the terrible gallery of fear, she realized with a sickening, crushing certainty that the woman in the oil painting upstairs was not just a relative, but Cecilia Hawthorne herself, forever bound to the house, and that the house was an anchor for the ancient entity, an eldritch horror that fed on the distilled agony of human souls captured in a single, final work of art. Her horrified gaze settled on the latest painting, still wet with fresh crimson paint, which depicted a pair of terrified, wide-open eyes staring directly back at her, eyes that she knew were her mother's, and the realization struck her that the accident that orphaned her was no accident at all, but the price paid for Alara's brief, monstrous immortality, her parents having been the last unwitting models for the entity's horrifying collection. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the wall, coalescing into a towering, shifting form of pure, sentient darkness, its features indistinct, yet conveying an unbearable hunger, the air turning ice-cold as 1,000 tiny, needle-sharp fingers of pure blackness began to crawl across her skin. The entity did not speak, but its thoughts flooded Cecilia's mind, a terrifying torrent of ancient power and insatiable desire, promising her everything: wealth, skill, power, if only she would complete the final piece of art, the last painting the collection required to achieve total, unholy completion. With a cry of absolute, animal terror that was muffled instantly by the surrounding darkness, Cecilia scrambled for the journal, reading the final, terrifying sentence aloud through chattering teeth. The artist's sacrifice must be willing, or the house takes only the body, but never the gift. Knowing she could never escape the malevolent, hungry mansion, and absolutely refusing to allow the creature to consume her soul and use her innate artistic gift to eternally damn others, Cecilia grabbed a sharp, obsidian shard from the altar, pressing the cold, jagged edge deep into the palm of her dominant hand, slicing through tendon and muscle in a single, desperate, bloody motion. The pain was immediate, blinding, and overwhelming, causing her to scream a soundless, visceral cry as her blood, thick and dark, spilled onto the stone floor, the sudden, terrible wound instantly rendering her drawing hand useless, crippling the only talent the entity truly desired to possess. The shadowy, amorphous creature shrieked, a deafening sound that reverberated through the very stones of the house, instantly receding as its source of eternal artistic sustenance was destroyed. The ethereal entity, knowing that the gift could no longer be used to capture the exquisite agony of a victim's final moments. Cecilia collapsed onto the freezing stone, her vision blurring, watching as the pool of her dark, vital blood slowly began to seep into the grooves of the obsidian altar, her life ebbing away with every frantic heartbeat, knowing that she had sacrificed her life, but saved her soul. The green light in the cavern began to fade, the paintings turning to dust, the entity's presence weakening and dissipating like smoke. But the silence that returned was more dreadful than the previous noise, a silence that confirmed the house was still standing, still waiting, and still deeply cursed, merely slumbering until the next Hawthorne heir arrived. As the last shreds of consciousness fled her blood-soaked body, Cecilia's final, terrified thought was not of her parents, but of the heavy front doors slamming shut, realizing that the curse of Primrose Hill was not inheritance, but a ritualistic invitation to perpetual, artistic sacrifice, and she had become the latest, unwilling addition to the dark estate's eternal, grotesque history. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the steps of Primrose Hill, while the house itself settled back into its suffocating silence, the empty front window now slightly ajar, waiting for the next lonely soul to receive a mysterious letter, a final, chilling note of inevitable tragedy and horror.